Welcome back to the swamp, my friends. Glad to see you made it back for another video. A topic we cover a lot on this channel is the great outdoors. I put out multiple videos a month on this topic alone. Today, I thought it would be fun to compile some of those stories together for you guys to enjoy in a longer format. So yes, I do understand you probably have heard these before. Anyways, if you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, whether it's from the great outdoors or something else, be sure to submit your story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that keep this channel going. Before we get into these stories, here are the winners of my recent giveaway. Thank you guys so much for supporting the swamp. I'll be doing another merch giveaway very soon, so anybody who didn't win, don't worry, it'll be happening again soon. Now, let's get into these creepy and downright strange stories from the outdoors. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Dee, and one cool October morning I decided to take my wife, Joanne, camping. We spent the morning packing the supplies we would need. Once we had everything we needed, we locked up our house and drove about 15 minutes to our land out in Somerville, Georgia. Once we arrived and found a good spot, we didn't have much time to do what we needed, so I quickly unloaded the truck and asked Joanne to start assembling the tent while I get some firewood. As I approached the woods, I got a feeling that someone was watching me, so as soon as I chopped up enough wood, I began building and lighting the fire because the sun was setting quickly. Joanne had already had the tent up, so now we could relax. We sat around the fire roasting and eating hot dogs when I noticed the fire getting smaller and smaller, so I grabbed my headlight and machete and went to get more firewood. I walked inside the tree line about 15 feet and found some good dry wood, and as I was chopping, I heard what sounded like footsteps crunching in the leaves behind me. I quickly turned around to illuminate the area I heard it coming from, but I didn't see anything, so I tried my best to brush it off. I grabbed the wood I had cut and returned to camp. Joanne was ready to roast marshmallows, so I didn't tell her what I had just heard. I just built up the fire higher and sat down close to it, trying to warm back up. Once I got warm, I ate some s'mores with my wife and forgot all about it. We started to clean up our campsite and get ready for bed, when I realized I would need more firewood to stay warm until morning. So I returned to the wood line and immediately remembered the sounds I heard. So this time, I didn't enter the tree line. I just started cutting the wood that I could get to. When I had a good stack of wood, I reached down and collected it, and as I was standing back up, I caught a glimpse of an unnaturally dark object with reflective yellow and green eyes in the woods. I acted as though I didn't see anything, and I slowly walked back to the campsite where Joanne was already in the tent. I was placing the wood on the fire when I heard what sounded like a woman screaming in the distance. Joanne jumped out of the tent and asked, "Dee, what was that?" I told her not to worry. It was probably just a mountain lion, and it shouldn't bother us. So we went to bed thinking everything would be fine. God, we were wrong. I was awoken by Joanne shaking me. She whispered to me that she smells something dead, and she can hear something breathing loudly outside the tent. I no longer saw the warm glow of the fire, so I got worried. I grabbed my 9mm pistol slowly and sat up and unzipped the tent. Outside of the tent door about 40 feet ahead, I see a herd of deer staring at us. I could see every breath they took as they were blowing fog out of their noses because it was so cold. I yelled loudly to scare the deer away, and it worked. They all ran off. Well, except for one. It was slowly walking towards us. I could see it was a nice 12-pointer, but as he got closer, I noticed his coat was unusually dark and mangy. The smell of death got worse as the buck got closer. Then I noticed that his eyes were glowing yellow, and I didn't have my headlight on. That's when I knew something was wrong. I grabbed my headlight and pointed it towards the deer. That's when I saw that its skin was peeling off and hanging. I could see its skull through pieces in the meat. I knew there was no way this thing could be alive. The deer stopped walking, opened its mouth and out came a scream that we had heard before. At this point, Joanne was crying. I told her to run to the truck, crank it up, and be ready for me to jump in, and I'll watch her back. She made it to the truck and cranked it up without the buck even moving. It then began to slowly walk towards me again. It seemed he was only after me. I aimed my pistol at the buck's head and pulled the trigger. I'm not sure I even hit it, because it was now charging towards me. I had 6 more rounds and I shot them all. It slowed the deer down, but at no way did it stop it. I had no way to defend myself. It was almost to my tent when Joanne crashed into it with the truck. I jumped in as fast as I could and we drove away, leaving everything we had behind. We came back later that day to get all of our belongings and see if what we still hit was still there. After taking 7 bullets and being hit by a 6,000-pound truck, there was no blood and no sign that anything was ever there. We haven't been camping since. This all took place when I was 14. It was a Saturday, and we were going camping in one of the more rural parts of Jamaica. I won't name the place for privacy reasons, but first, here's some background. As I said, I'm 14, about 5'3", and a medium frame build. In other words, I was a big kid. Anyway, back to the story. The campsite that we were going to was about an hour and a half worth of driving. When we get there, we get our stuff from the truck and started hiking to find a good spot. We come across a nice, calm, crisp-looking stream, so we decide to stop here and get some dinner right away. About 2 hours later, we pack up and start again. By now, it's about 4:30 p.m. We finally find a good enough spot to set up. All of a sudden, we pick up this awful, pungent stench. It honestly smelled like expired sour cream and rotten eggs mixed in a toilet that hadn't been cleaned for 6 years and left in the sun. And it was close. I felt chills go down my spine and a wave of dread rushed over me when I heard the shrillest, most ear-piercing screech I had ever heard in my life. I grabbed the sawed-off double-barrel shotgun and ran inside the tent. I actually fell asleep quickly, despite it only being 6 p.m. At about 2 a.m., I had awoken to the sound of a branch snapping, and to make matters worse, I had to use the bathroom. Me being a horror movie enthusiast knew all too well what not to do in situations like these. I laid still with the double barrel in my hand, ready to fire it if it came to the test. Fast forward about 10 minutes later when I heard my uncle scream. I quickly woke my dad up, who was sleeping next to me, and slowly walked out there to see what was going on. At first I was thinking he was just playing a trick on us. Nothing could have ever prepared me for what I saw. This thing was at least 8 feet tall. It had the smell I described earlier. It had 2 horns sticking out of its head, and it stood on 2 awfully man-like legs. I thought I was in hell looking at the devil himself. Within no more than a second or two, I fired around into its leg. It jolted back, so human-like. A little too human-like. Then it happened. This thing turned around and acknowledged us, almost as if it wanted to speak. And it did. I don't remember exactly what it said, but it spoke in a deep, raspy, manly voice. I remember it having hellish, red gleaming eyes that stared through my soul. I shot at it again, this time the back of its disgusting devil-like back covered with white, dirty, disgusting looking fur. About 5 seconds or so, the thing ran off into the woods, leaving a trail of blood. I looked over at my uncle. He was almost in tears, and as for my dad, he was just frozen. I don't know what the hell this thing was, and I don't know how I wasn't crying. We all stayed up in one tent packing our stuff, planning to book it back to the truck as soon as the sun came up. After about 7 hours, the sun finally came up and we did what we planned to do. When we got to the truck, we started it and drove out of there like a bat out of hell. On the ride home, we didn't say a word, nor did we when we got home. You'd think the story ends here. Well, not all fairy tales have happy endings. About 2 weeks later, we went down to the countryside to camp with my aunt, uncle, and cousins. This drive was about 3 hours away from where we lived, so we were going to spend the night with them. Obviously, that was our intention anyway. When we get there, we see them all standing on the front patio waiting for us with a look of joy on their faces. Now, to describe the place, it was about 5 acres of empty woodland area, but it had great lighting around the house from the LED solar-powered lights. Anyway, after about 10 minutes of talking and catching up, we all go inside and make our way to the bathroom to freshen up. When I'm finished, I get out and make my way to the room I'm staying in, and 2 of my cousins, Brian and Mario, out of the 6, are in the room playing Forza Horizon 4 on the PS4. When it's about 10 p.m., I decide I'm going to bed. I said my goodnights and went up to my room. It was dark, but I didn't think to turn on the light. I just went straight to bed and tucked in. I heard the door open, but I just brushed it off as my cousins. About 2 hours later, Mario comes in, turns on the light, and screams. I will never forget the look on his face when I asked what's wrong. He looked as though if he had just killed someone accidentally. It was almost as if he wanted to say oops and started raging. He was in total awe. It was the thing from earlier. It just walked over to the open window, which was about 2 stories off the ground, made its way down, and walked away into the woods as if nothing had ever happened. It moved so human-like, so disgusting, so purposely. When everyone ran up to us and asked what had happened, we all finished them telling the story. Brian simply said one word: Goatman. Fortunately, this was the last time I personally had an experience with this creature, and I hope I never will again. But sometimes I still wonder what would have happened if I turned on the light, or if Mario didn't come in when he did, or if he had laid down next to this thing without bothering to turn the light. I'm glad I don't know. One night last year during the fall, I was camping on my property with my wife. It's all in a secluded forest on a private lake in Georgia, so we don't have any neighbors within 30 miles. After I gathered some firewood from some small trees that I had cut down, I heard this noise coming from the west side, from where I was standing. I wasn't skeptical about it at first, cause it came from a great distance, as it was a low echo. I went back to the campfire, and sometime around an hour later, we did some fishing for catfish while the moon was full. I heard the noise again, and it was closer to us this time, but possibly about 1,000 yards away. We don't have many bears in this part of Georgia, if any. I've heard many recordings of Bigfoot on YouTube, but this thing sounded nothing like that. It was a monstrous sound like a raging gorilla. Whatever it was, it sounded a lot bigger than a man. My wife heard it too. We got too scared to stay any longer, so we packed up and headed back to the house. The next day, sometime in the afternoon, I went back to our camping location carrying my .30-30 rifle and walked a little over 1,000 yards toward the sound that we had heard last night. I came upon a muddy bank near the lake and saw these gigantic footprints. They were almost like a man's foot, but with bladed toes. The next thing I did was put my foot beside one of the footprints to measure it. My shoe size is 12, but the footprints were about 6 inches wider and 3 inches longer. What could it be? Let me know what you think this thing was, please. So before I get into this story, there are a few things I would like to clear up. First, this story takes place in Altamont, Tennessee, in mid-July of 2018. Second, I was in the Boy Scouts at the time. Third, I have some friends that I will be referring to in this story. Their names are Brad, Steve, Xavier, and Paul, respectively. 4, we were grouped in tents that had 2 each inside. I was in a tent with Steve, so Brad and Xavier were sharing a tent, and Paul was sharing a tent with somebody I can't recall. I was at a summer camp for 8 days, but I only spent 6 days at the camp, as it was a day's drive up and back. The first few days were pretty normal, honestly, but it was the night of the 3rd day when I couldn't sleep on account of the awful tents, which hardly closed and seemed to be infested with insects and arachnids of every kind. So I was awake for most of the night, listening to the sounds of the Tennessee woods, until I noticed some peculiar noises which didn't seem normal. I first noticed strange noises at around 1 a.m., 1 hour after lights out. First, it sounded like footsteps, but as time went on, I started to hear what sounded like whispering. I couldn't make out what it was saying, because it was barely audible. I was pretty shaken up, but eventually the noises quieted down and I managed to fall asleep. The next morning, I told Steve about it, and we both shrugged it off, although at that point I wasn't sure I had been dreaming or if I was awake. I forgot about it until that night shortly before lights out, when I remembered and told Brad, Xavier, and Paul. Even though I was dreading it, of course, I would have to go to sleep eventually. When I made my way to my tent, I unsurprisingly couldn't fall asleep, but not because of the noises. I couldn't sleep because I had what seemed like 6 billion bugs in my tent. At about 12:30 to 1 a.m., the noises started, this time more loud and intense. The noises started with footsteps, but the footsteps quickly evolved into voices themselves. Not whispers, but full volume talking and possibly even yelling at one point. Then the sounds morphed into chirping and squeaking. At one point I even heard what sounded like a medieval battle horn, like in the Narnia movies. Eventually, I grew tired of cowering in my tent and decided to go check out what the noises could be. I went down to the bathrooms, which were about 200 feet away and down a hill from my tent. When I got to the bathroom, I realized the squeaking noises seemed to be coming from a leaky old house, which was a huge relief. I relieved myself and went back to my tent. I laid down and it appeared that the noises had stopped, but of course, that was only temporary. When the noises started up again, I called out in a slightly hushed tone, thinking it was somebody playing a prank. It was about 2:30 to 3 a.m. at this point, when my friend Paul responded to my call and came over to my tent. Paul said that he had been up for a while because of the bugs in his tent when he noticed the noises too. He had been up for about 30 minutes when he heard me and came over to my tent. Paul and I hung out in Steve and I's tent for a while. Steve slept through the entire night, even with Paul and I trying to wake him up. While we were in the tent, the noises would stop and start repeatedly, alternating every 10 minutes or so. While Paul and I were in my tent, with Steve sleeping next to us in the tent, we noticed that the footsteps were getting increasingly closer and louder. The footsteps were so much that it sounded like they were right outside our tent. We figured it was another kid who was in the tent nearby named Eddie. He may have been sleepwalking because he was known to do that sometimes. We called out to Eddie asking if he was alright. There was no answer though. We shrugged it off and continued talking. Eventually Paul got tired and returned to his tent at about 4 a.m. Honestly, at this point, I decided I would try to get some sleep too. I had been laying down for all of 10 minutes when the noises started up, and I realized I would not be getting any sleep that night, and decided to walk around the camp and try to find the source of these noises. I did not find anything. However, I did walk by Brad and Xavier's tent. I decided to see if they were awake by whispering into the side of their tent. Brad was awake, Xavier was not. I asked Brad if he had heard the noises, which he said he had. Brad had said he was up listening to the noises for about an hour when I came over. I told Brad to keep his ears open for any more weird noises and went back to my tent. About 20 minutes later, I started to hear the noises start up again. I decided to wait a few minutes to see if the noises would stop. The noises did not stop. I decided to go check around the campsite again. This time, though, I went to Brad and Xavier's tent first to recruit them to help me check. When I got over there, both Brad and Xavier were awake. It was sometime between 5:30 and 6 a.m., so Xavier and Brad came out of their tent and walked with me around the campsite. We had checked the entire area and were about to return to our tents. We happened to be walking by the end of a huge rectangular clearing behind our campsite when we saw a strange animal at the other end of it. It was no more than 200 feet away if I had to guess. The thing looked like it was prone. It was completely still, just watching us. We didn't know what it was, so we started walking toward it. When it realized we were coming closer, it got up, and this is when we realized that we weren't looking at any ordinary animal. This thing was like 4 feet tall and humanoid, with a hunched posture and huge glowing orange eyes about the size of tennis balls. Its head appeared to be pushed into its torso, giving it an appearance similar to that of the depictions of the Mothman. When it got up, it started hobbling away towards a large ditch. As we got closer, it became more frantic and started to move faster. By the time we got there, it was long gone and the ditch was empty. We checked the area in which it had been and found nothing of importance. Though, hilariously, we did find an empty bag of Planters peanuts about 10 feet away from where the creature had been. I have no idea what we saw that night, but I am sure we saw something we can all agree on that is not natural. I spent hours searching for anything about the creature we saw, but have not found any evidence of this creature's existence online. I am sending in this story in hopes that it will be spread around, and eventually I will have an answer for what we saw that night. I want to start off by saying that hindsight is a B word, and I know now looking back at all the things I did wrong, and how things could have turned out much better if I had just listened to my gut. But anyways, this situation takes place quite a few years back when I was in Boy Scouts. My troop had announced that summer that we were going to go to a new camp, and that camp would be Camp Woodruff. It's a camp in Georgia, and you can look it up online if you can't take my word for it. My grandpa was an Eagle Scout back in his day, and he was a troop leader now. Since he was going, I decided I would too, because I wanted to spend more time with my grandfather. My grandma had passed away about a year prior. The only problem is, I didn't know how to do summer camp, as I've never attended one before. When I got there, I realized this was going to suck majorly. The tents my troop were staying in were full of non-lethal forest spiders, and, for an arachnophobe like me, it was hell on earth. The goal of being here was to earn badges for your sash and bond with your fellow scouts, which is a great way for young men to gather some special skills and have some fun. But I can't find the joy in tying knots when I didn't even like scouting in the first place. However, later on in the week, we would be going to an independent horse ranch, and they would allow us scouts who wanted to go on a trail on a horse. Horse riding day came, and I was extremely excited, especially because I got to ride near the front with the rancher tour guide. His name was Trent, and he was so cool to my 17-year-old mind. I have always loved and appreciated horses, as it was on their backs America was built before machines. The horse is a proud and noble animal that has always been by humans and most likely always will be. So as we were going along the trail, Trent told us to stop and let the horses drink a bit from an upcoming stream. Trent let his horse take his swigs of water, and when it was time for my horse, a snake of some kind wriggled in the stream, causing my horse to go bat crap crazy and buck me off. Here is where hindsight comes in. After I fell off my horse, my gut told me to stop and wait for the expert to calm the horse down. But I didn't want to wait on the ground with the snake. I rolled over and ended up cuddling the eviscerated remains of some poor buck or something. There was blood all over my neck, shirt, and even on my legs. I started to freak out even more and ran off a bit further down the trail. But in my panic, I lost my footing and fell down the side of a hill, which was about 9 feet or so. I felt so much pain in my hip because I landed sideways. When Trent and the rest of the troop saw where I was, they asked if I was okay, and I replied, "I'm not dead, just really scared." "Don't worry. Eventually the trail goes back down to the other side of this hill and curves around to you. Just wait there for us and you'll be fine." I heard the words Trent said, but the only thing I could think of was that carcass I ever so carelessly rolled into. I looked down at the back of my legs. I had a cut from my tumble down the hill. But I sat there and waited, and after about 15 minutes I started to hear screaming. It was weird though, because it sounded like I was screaming, which sadly was high-pitched and impossible to mimic. At first, I thought it was the rest of my troop who had come to mock me for causing my own literal downfall. But after I looked around, I realized it was not them. Otherwise, I would have heard the horses, or their talking and laughing. I sat in silence and heard something that still haunts my nightmares. In my own voice, I heard, "I'm really dead." This person or thing had twisted my own words around into a horrifying sentence. I looked around and saw this semi-hollow tree that looked like it was clinging on to the ground for dear life not to fall over. I dragged myself over to the tree and tried my best to conceal myself inside. I stayed still and concentrated all my remaining energy into not moving. I heard heavy movements outside the tree. I smelled the stench of copper, and then the smell of blood. Whatever was creeping around outside my hiding space was breathing heavily and screeching this ear-deafening scream. I wanted to cry, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I almost did. I silenced my breathing inside my shirt and prayed to God that whatever this thing was, it wouldn't find me. I stayed like this for who knows how many minutes. That felt like forever until I looked upon my shoulder and saw another freaking spider. I forgot my situation, and I screamed and ran outside the tree, where I kept running on pure adrenaline until I ran into another rancher that came from the stables to look for me when Trent radioed to them about my location. They heard the scream and assumed it was me. I tried my best to tell them about the thing that was lurking around here, but all that came out was a mumbled jumble of words. She helped me onto her horse, and she took me back to the barn where I got the blood hosed off of my leg and bandaged up. I tried to tell the few other adults what had happened, but they marked it up as hysteria and hallucinations from a panic attack. I didn't sleep for the last 3 nights that we were there, and honestly, I don't think I'll ever return to the woods of Georgia, ever again, because I've done my research and I think that creature that antagonized me was a Wendigo. So I have submitted 3 stories to you, and you have graciously read 2 of them on your channel. My name is Evan, and the 2 stories you read were about cryptids, and so is this story. The difference is that this story is from my mom's point of view. As I stated in the last 2 stories, I live in rural Maryland, but my mom grew up in the mountains of Tennessee. Her father was an avid hunter and cared for his family very well. They lived on a large section of woodland near a dirt road, in a log A-frame home. Her father worked at car auctions and was often gone for weeks at a time on road trips with his team. This led to my mother Lisa becoming a very accustomed person to exploring the woods with her sister. Her mom took care of the property, but also worked at a local restaurant 4 days out of the week. Again, this left my mom and her sister with the task of occupying themselves. My mom loved the outdoors and the woods surrounding her home. It was perfect for exploring. Her father whittled a small wooden slingshot for her, and she would spend all day shooting pebbles at the creek and climbing small trees. Now, this encounter took place when my mom was 9, in July of the year 1979. My grandma had taken my mom's sister to the doctor because she had sprained her ankle the day prior and was having trouble walking. My mom decided, like most days, that she would do some deep woods exploring. She grabbed her slingshot and set out. Her mom called after her to not be too late for dinner. The sun was already getting low in the sky and the thick trees didn't help this matter. My mom wasn't scared of the dark. She ran through the brambles, singing and stopping every once in a while to shoot her slingshot. She eventually got to the creek and sat down on the soft bank to refill her pebble supply. As she was picking up pebbles, she heard a noise. Whenever she retells this to me or any sibling, she always says, "It's like the crickets lost their voice and the birds had no more songs to sing." The forest was utterly silent, as she recalled, and she didn't realize why at first. She got up from the creek bank. Standing across the creek on the other side of the bank is what she called a big hairy man. She wasn't familiar with the stories about Bigfoot, but she knew this was no human. It looked at her and she said it felt like it was staring right through her soul. Then it let out a massive, guttural call that she felt in her chest. She tried to cry, being a little girl in the deep woods with a Bigfoot in front of her. As if the thing realized it scared her, it stood up to its full height and she realized it was only kneeling. She said it must have been 6 feet tall while on its knees, but around 9 feet standing up. As my mom turned to run, she heard it let out another call, even louder than the first one. My mom got back to the house in record speed and her clothes were torn and her legs were bloody from tripping twice. When my grandma asked why and what had happened, she said she fell from a tree. I don't think she thought my grandma would believe her. She never told this story until maybe about 5 years ago. I was shocked but believed her because my mom is no liar. So, that's her story. I appreciate you sharing my stories I've sent you, and I hope you can share this one as well. I hope you're doing well during this crazy time, and be safe out there, folks, because there are some things that we just can't explain in life. I am an avid outdoorsman and a fellow swamp dweller. I was once a well-known outdoor survivalist YouTuber from the early years of YouTube, when 10K subscribers was a lot. So, I won't be using any names just in case a few of you may remember us. This took place in Florida back in 2010 during the summer. Me and two friends were camping on the Alafia River, on a bend in the river not too far downstream from a county park built around a local spring. We loved the spot, and went there frequently in the early years of our channel. The area is much more developed now, and since we made videos out there, the place lost its charm as more and more people have discovered it. We seldom go back now. This particular trip, we decided to camp right on the river in a spot that afforded a beautiful view of it, and the surrounding flora and fauna. To get there, you just had to follow the trail that eventually went down an embankment and turned to run along the river for a dozen yards or so. We usually camped atop said embankment and even had semi-permanent shelter up for a while, but decided to go down and set up camp along the river trail instead. We set up camp, gathered wood, started our fire, cooked, drank, and relaxed. Night eventually fell, and we all turned in around the same time. I believe it was around 10 p.m. or so. We had of course been telling stories of the skunk ape, which is Sasquatch's smaller and smellier cousin from Florida. I have an odd habit of not being able to sleep much when I go camping unless I am the first person to fall asleep. If not, I kind of just doze off and wake up every few minutes. I'm never really ever asleep. In this case, I was not the first one out. I soon heard soft snoring from the other tent shared by my two companions on this weekend trip. So I settled into a comfortable position in my little dome tent and drifted between wakefulness and sleep for a few hours. Always keeping an ear out. One thing about rainy Florida summer nights is the sounds of the swamp. Being right off the river, there was a constant cacophony of frogs, toads, crickets, and the odd nocturnal bird, all screaming into the night as they try to get laid. While it can be loud, there is a natural rhythm to it that I enjoyed. There were even some coyotes yipping somewhere off and across the river from us. Suddenly, all the sound ceased. I came fully awake and laid still for just a moment, eyes open as I tried to puzzle out what was off. It was when I heard the gentle trickle of water from the river that I realized everything had gone quiet. I sat up and tried my best to peek out from under the rainfly of my tent, which was covering the screen. I would normally be able to see out of it, but I could not see more than just a sliver. It was so dark outside, it really didn't help anything either. I heard crunching and the rustling of leaves on the embankment above us, in the spot that we would normally camp. I listened for a moment, figuring it was either the raccoon I had chased off earlier with a slingshot, or, even more likely, an armadillo, which was abundant in our area and can make enough noise in the brush to make you think it was a bear charging at you. It was then that I noticed the crunching was following the pattern of a person walking through the brush on two legs, not the slithering rustle of a small game moving around. At this point, I figured either one of my companions was up trying to spook me, or a local had come out and was walking around at night with no flashlight, which was a pretty disturbing and questionable prospect in and of itself. The footfalls moved across the embankment above me towards the top of the trail that led down to where we were. My tent was set up in the grass at the base of the trail, right where it leveled off and turned to follow the river. My companion's tent was set up a few yards away on the left of the trail. The footfalls made it to the top of the trail and stopped, They were maybe 10 or 12 feet away from where I sat. My trepidation grew as seconds passed in eerie silence. There was a sudden loud crack of wood from the embankment above me, the unmistakable sound of a tree branch being whacked and broken against the trunk of a tree. I knew this for certain because we had been doing the same thing earlier in order to break down large dead branches of firewood. Another whack sounded, this time closer to my tent. I reached over and quietly scooped up my large Maglite LED flashlight and my machete. I placed them both in my lap as I sat up. I was sitting cross-legged, waiting patiently. I usually carried a pistol with me, but left it in the car on this trip for a reason I can no longer recall. The footfalls at the top of the trail started again, one after another. This time I could feel the weight of them in the seat of my pants as they came. This thing was heavy. The ground vibrated with the thump under its weight with each step. My skin began to prickle as my neck and ears grew hot with the sudden rush of fear. The footfalls stopped within an arm's reach of my tent. I listened hard and thought that I could make out the faint sound of something breathing quietly. Ragged, in the darkness outside, I knew it was focused on me. The crushing weight of its attention drove me to near panic, as though some long-forgotten instinct woke inside me and knew that I needed to get out of here. It needed me to run. It's the only survival. My breathing grew rapid and shallow, my chest tight as I continued to listen to the dead silence outside of my tent. Then as suddenly as it came, the dreaded weight lifted. I felt and heard the thing move past me down the trail towards my friend's tent. The frogs and crickets resumed, causing me to nearly jump out of my skin at the sudden rush of sound. As the thing moved past me, I was able to will myself to the flap of my tent where I slowly unzipped it enough from the top corner in order to get my flashlight through. I clicked my flashlight on and kept a tight grip on my machete as the bright LED beam lit up the night like a white mini sun. I swept it back and forth and saw nothing of what had just passed. Still too scared to get out, I zipped my tent up and resumed my cross-legged position. For the rest of the night, flashlight and machete held across my lap in case it came back. Dawn came 2.5 hours later. I heard the zipper of the other tent open, so I also emerged. I saw my friend exit his tent, bleary-eyed as he moved off into the thicket of bushes to relieve himself in the pre-dawn light. I approached and asked him if he heard anything last night. He said he did, but he figured it was me walking around trying to creep them out. Told them it wasn't. He kind of shrugged it off and went back into his tent. I stayed outside and searched for signs of the thing, and I found nothing. No tracks or depressions in the ground, no bent or broken branches or twigs, no tufts of fur or hair, nothing. When my companions fully awoke and emerged from their tent for breakfast, I addressed it with them again, and they again said they just thought it was me walking around. I described what I felt, but only got looks of disbelief from them. Something to note about this experience: there was no smell, which is something of a telltale sign of a skunk ape in the other folks' accounts of running into one. The only thing that really points it to being a skunk ape would be the tree knocking, and the one thing that makes me dismiss it as a person was the feeling of dread that it brought with it. I have never felt anything like what I did that night. I had once been stalked by an elusive Florida panther, and it was nothing close to this thing. What was it? I may never know. Camping and hiking in the backcountry has always been my passion since I was old enough to go out on my own and travel to different locations. I've been fortunate enough in my life to be able to go to some of the most remote and beautiful places in the United States. Needless to say, I've seen some pretty strange things, and at times I've been downright terrified of the encounters I've had out in the bush. I've always believed in the supernatural and the unexplained, having grown up in an extremely haunted house which sat on an old Native American reservation. But that's a story for another time. With all that being said, I still can't begin to explain what happened to me and one of my closest friends in the mountains of Arizona one night. After a long week of work, my friend John and I decided we would go to a well-known mountain range just north of Phoenix to hit up some of the off-road Jeep trails and spend the weekend camping at one of my favorite spots. For obvious reasons, I won't disclose the exact location, but if you live in the area, you probably know exactly where I'm talking about. After a few hours of driving across the rough terrain, we finally arrived at the trailhead. We parked our Jeeps and gathered our gear and began our half-an-hour hike to the campsite. The trailhead is not well known or heavily used at all. I've gone to the spot for years, and hell, sometimes I still drive right past it if I'm not looking hard enough. After a while of hiking, we finally reached the campsite. Now, this place is absolutely beautiful. It's right on the edge of the mountain overlooking the Salt River, and usually, there's not another soul for miles. I've made countless solo trips here and have always felt at ease, even after a close encounter with a mountain lion coming inside of my camp. But this time, I don't know, something was definitely off, and I could tell that John felt it too because he was a lot more tense than usual and seemed to be on high alert. We tried to brush it off and ignore it as best as we could, and got our campsite set up. After a few beers and sitting around a small fire later that night, we started to relax just a bit. It was starting to get late, so I decided I was going to call it a night. Just as I started to stand up, a rock the size of a baseball comes hurling out of the wood and nails a tree right beside my feet. What the heck? I stood there stunned for a second, before reaching for my rifle. John jumped up and pulled out his pistol. "Hey, if there's someone out there, you better make yourself known right now," I yelled as I and John started walking in the direction that rock came from. We got no reply. No sound of footsteps, not even a slight breeze. It was dead silent. So much that my ears were ringing. After a few minutes of investigating the area and finding absolutely nothing, we returned back to the fire and decided it best to stay up and be alert for a little longer in case something else happens. About an hour goes by and John and I are starting to calm down and are just sitting around talking. All of a sudden, a large tree branch flies out of the trees and lands on John's tent, ripping a massive hole in the roof. We jumped up and both aim our guns in the direction that the branch flew in from. We fire a few rounds. Maybe this was not a good idea, but we did it anyway. We hear something massive tearing through the trees. At first we thought it was running away from us, but we realized it was running a circle around us. We shined our lights in all directions, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever or whoever this was messing with us. At this point, we were both shaken up and started gathering what we could to stuff in our packs and get the heck out of there. John grabs my arm and says, "Stop. Do you hear that?" He started looking back towards the edge of the mountain. At first I didn't hear anything, but after a second I could make out a low hum. It was a very low, but high-pitched whistle that was vibrating the ground slightly, but it was coming from about 50 feet past the edge of the mountain. Like, there was no possible way anyone or anything could be out there, unless it could fly. I started walking towards the sound slowly, scanning the tree line around me. As we slowly moved towards the edge, I lift up my light and shine it towards the unexplained sound. As I did, rocks and large sticks and even parts of a cactus flew in from off the edge, bombarding us. It was like shrapnel. We ran the full 30-minute hike in about 10 to 15 minutes to our Jeeps and threw the few things we managed to grab in the back and just hauled absolute ass out of there. We never went back to the tents, and I haven't been camping in that place ever since. I've heard a lot of scary stories about that area, ranging from Bigfoot to UFOs and even skinwalkers. But after those events, I still have no idea what terrorized us that night. I don't plan on going back to find out, but if you live in the area and know kinda where I'm talking about, if you are unlucky enough to stumble upon an abandoned campsite at the edge of a mountain, do yourself a favor, turn around and go the other way. Hello there. I've been listening to your program for a while and decided to share this. Maybe another listener has had this happen to them, because I still don't really know what this was. I grew up with acres upon acres of woods behind my house. A farmer owned most of it, but no one paid mind to us. There were huge fields on both sides of the woods, and the farmer at one point had trails going through the woods to move cows from one pasture to the other. My brother, sister, and I would regularly be found playing out there. There was a creek back there too. We could fish or swim, or muck-luck, or whatever you want. Muck-lucking is basically playing in the mud, catching frogs and salamanders. We'd been out there in any weather, any season, in the daylight, in the dark, you name it. I used to hike the woods on moonlit nights as a kid and was quite comfortable in its surroundings. The location of my home was in southeastern Pennsylvania, Chester County. The area still had plenty of open space at the time, and wildlife was really just foxes, raccoon, deer, squirrel, etc. Nothing too scary or aggressive, and the coyotes hadn't come back at this point. I'm about 10 or 11 when this occurred. My friend Haley and I had been hiking for most of the morning and had gone up through the hills, through the woods to the top of the pasture. The trees were less there, and they had these huge vines that we used to make swings out of. We had hung out for a while and then headed back down the hill towards the woods. The day was sunny and clear and a really nice autumn day. As we entered the woods and made our way to the trail, the clouds started to move in. It got grayer and a little cold. Nothing major. Haley and I were enjoying shuffling through the leaves, and it sounded like the sound of the leaves were being echoed, like we'd shuffle and something would shuffle behind us. I stopped and told Haley that something was copying me. She shuffled forward and said, "See, I'm not copying you." After she shuffled, we heard the leaves move behind us up the hill a bit, and we both turned to see if it was a deer or something else. But what we saw was something entirely different. It was like a man deer or a deer man or whatever you would want to call it. It was coming right towards us. We know how protective they get, and we knew that the buck could get a little gnarly too. So, as we were looking, we hear the lowest growl that made the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. Haley grabs my arm and we slowly start backing up. I swear on my mother's grave that we backed up. You could see the leaves moving like something was walking through them, but we couldn't see them actually move. It was only about 30 feet away, and we would move behind trees to try to get a better look while backing up. I was trying to rationalize it in my brain by saying it was just a deer. The leaves moved out of the way of whatever was walking through them, and it was large. It kept coming down the hill just behind us, and the growl came again, louder this time. A growl that rumbled in my chest. We turned tail and bolted it out of those woods as fast as we could, and it felt like this thing was close behind. I can remember Haley falling when we reached the line between the woods and my backyard, and I remember dragging her by the arm until she caught her feet. I was still trying to catch a glance and trying to see if I saw anything, but I still saw nothing chasing us. We ran straight to the house and hid looking from her bedroom window. We had a clear view from her window to our woods, yet nothing ever came out. We didn't go into the woods for a while, and even so, we only enter a couple of feet before we'd feel like we were being watched. My brother and his friend had a similar run-in, but luckily had their quads. They were further in the woods and were fishing, just like our day. He said it started to get cloudy and colder, kind of out of the blue, and he said he heard someone on the trail further down. This is opposite of where the trail goes from our house. It's deeper in towards a waterfall. He said it sounded like someone was riding their horse down towards them. He called out to them because he didn't want the rider or the horse to get spooked since everything is kind of on a bend. Instead of a voice, a growl was the response. He then said he and Gary didn't waste any time. They left all their tackle and poles and flew home on the quads. I hadn't told my brother about what happened to me and Haley, but I think these occurrences are definitely connected. What do you guys think? It was near the end of 2018, sometime around November, so it was damp and pretty cold out, but nonetheless still comfortable for me when I got a call from my friend Joe. He wanted to come up to my house and stay for a few days to get out of the city, so to speak, because I live up in the mountains. The usual middle-of-nowhere type old wooden house with my mom who rarely was home for more than 2 to 3 hours at a time due to her job in the mountains of Tennessee, yada yada. You know, backwoods areas, you've heard this story a million times. We have neighbors, but they're a good distance from our house, so we don't know them all that well. Enough details for now, though. So I get off the phone with Joe and proceed to drive to the city where, of course, me and him hang out for a while and play some video games, and slightly we lost track of time. When we left, thanks to the time of year, it was already dark. It was maybe around 6:30 to 7 p.m. when we got back to my place and it had begun sprinkling rain on the ride up, but we get there no problem. We go in and start setting up the game stations to begin the night of games and movies. Typical stuff we did. It's around 10 p.m. when we have everything set up and slight rain had subsided, so we opened up the window to cool the room a bit. The backyard is dark, and I mean dark. It leads straight into the woods beside the small shack in my yard. But it never bothered us because we were halfway through our movie when I and Joe both heard a faint metallic-like sound coming from the woods, which caused Joe to pause the movie and ask if I had heard the noise. I said I had, so we had listened for a moment and heard it again, but it sounded closer. It was windy, so I blamed it on the wind, and plus we have a tin roof, but we resumed the movie and kind of forgot about it, until about 30 minutes later when we heard it again, but this time much louder than before. It sounded like someone hitting a metal baseball bat against a tree. So I paused the movie again and I and Joe just look at each other and decide to stay quiet and turn the lights down and take a look out the window. We saw nothing but keep hearing it move around the woods, so to speak. We started getting a little freaked out, but turned the movie back on and lowered the volume mostly, as a ploy to act as if we were ignoring it again. But we were really listening intently to the outside noises and the sound quickly stopped. They now transitioned to the side of my house, just under the opened window. We froze and for what felt like 5 minutes straight, we just stared at my window, seeing nothing but the darkness and slight glow of the floodlight coming from outside the house. We soon saw a shadow in the light, and then all at once the light shook and went out. We turned and ran into the front room and grabbed the light and anything we could use as a non-lethal weapon and bolted outside to the area from which the sound was coming from. It was coming from just under the window, but there was nothing there. There was no sound, no light, but my floodlight was unscrewed in on my porch, which really freaked us out. So I quickly put the light back up, and we had a brief look around when it began raining pretty hard. We stopped our search and came to the conclusion that whoever or whatever unscrewed this thing was gone. We assumed it didn't want to stay in the rain, as we didn't either. We got back inside thinking about what had just happened. As I went to look out the window, I saw what looked to be a man standing in the dark looking at me from behind the shack in my backyard. I was scared, I won't lie, but I kept talking to Joe as if I didn't see him. I walked over to Joe, who was at my desk, and I calmly told him what I saw and retrieved the 9mm handgun I had for home protection due to previous incidents. I stow it in my lap and hoped that whoever it is outside would just leave. It seemed like he had for about an hour until we heard loud footsteps on my porch near the floodlight and then a series of loud banging on my wall right where we were sitting. I stood up and cocked my handgun when I saw the outside light go out again. I moved to the window and shoved nearly my whole upper body out of the window and fired at least 7 shots right under the house outside the light. I saw the man run into the woods wildly off into the dark again. Silence and darkness crept over us again for the remainder of the night. We kept the lights on and the window shut, and nothing else happened. All has been quiet ever since. This happened to me and my friend, Scott, about 1 month ago. It was late June. My friend and I were going camping in the Adirondack Mountains. We were going to stay in my grandfather's cabin. It was on the edge of the Adirondacks, about 20 miles from Old Forge. My friend and I were very interested in cryptids and stuff like that. We took this trip just to kind of relax and get away from our everyday stress. Our camp is right next to a creek. We got there about 3 hours, and we just relaxed the first day. There was one creepy thing about the camp. We only had 3 camps near us, and one of them was an abandoned camper that looked like it was from the 1990s. My grandpa said he has never seen people there or lights on or anything. We went hiking and swimming on the first day. We got back to the camp at about 5 p.m., and we just relaxed for a couple of hours. At some time around 9 p.m., we decided to start a fire. We brought flashlights and a knife just in case. It didn't start getting weird till about 10 p.m. We went inside to get more wood, and we looked to where the abandoned camper was. There were lights on all around it. Scott and I just looked at each other confused. There were obviously logical explanations for this though. We decided to shrug it off and went back to the fire. We were just sitting there when we started to hear stuff on the other side of the creek. Branches breaking. Footsteps, it sounded like. We both heard it, but every time we shined our flashlight over there, we saw nothing, and the noises would stop. Later, at about 10:30, we heard something run across the creek in the water and heard noises on our side of the creek. We went back to the house, thinking that it was over. At about 11 p.m., we heard something bang on the cabin door. There was no way in hell we were going to get up and check that. We just sat there in pure silence. We then heard the thing walk to the other side of the cabin, and we thought it was over. We were wrong. We started hearing noises on the roof. It sounded like something crawling on the roof trying to get into the cabin. It eventually stopped and we fell asleep. Now, it doesn't stop here either. The next morning, we ate breakfast and decided to go on a walk. It was about a 2-mile hike on roads in the middle of the forest. There was only one house on this hike. The first part of the hike was normal. Then we got to the part in the forest. We were heading down this hill when we saw this thing. It looked like a very pale human on all fours crawling on the road. It was very skinny, and if I had to say, it was probably about 6.5 feet tall or so. It was the stuff out of nightmares. It turned at us, looked at us, and made this high-pitched screech. It darted to the side of the road and into the forest. We ran back just in case this thing was going to chase us while it was in the forest. I've been doing some research on what this thing was, and it sounds like it could be a crawler. What do you guys think? For background information, this happened to me when I was 13 or 14 years old. The year was either 2010 or 2011. My family and I, along with my sister's boyfriend and my best friend, went and stayed at a friend's lakeside cabin for a weekend getaway. For the sake of the story, I'll call my best friend Jay and my sister's boyfriend Tom. So the lakeside cabin we were staying in was a really nice place. It had about 4 bedrooms and a decent plot of land right on the water, a fire pit, and a hammock. A perfect place to spend a relaxing weekend. There were a lot of neighboring houses and the lake varying between beautiful $500,000 cabins and then some normal-sized ones. But all in all, they were all really nice. The lake is pretty far out in the middle of nowhere, in rural, upstate New York, so you get that a lot. Nothing but trees for miles. There was one outlier, however. There was an abandoned cabin about 4 or so houses down from the one we were staying at that bordered the woods, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in 20 years. The small concrete front porch was still cracked in half, trees were overgrown, and it was just a fairly creepy sight. I convinced my best friend Jay and my sister's boyfriend Tom to go explore it. For reference, my best friend and I were 13 or 14 at the time and Tom was 20 or 21. We went to explore it on the second day we were there. We made sure not to tell my parents as they definitely wouldn't have liked the idea. So we entered the front door, which was surprisingly completely unlocked. Or maybe just the old age and neglect had deteriorated the lock. I'm not sure. As soon as we went in, we could see no one had been there for years. It was very apparent. There was dust everywhere, and there were animal feces all up and down the staircase that was immediately in front of the front door. We went into the kitchen, and I recall everything being really outdated, but nothing really out of the ordinary. So we went to check in the living room next, and that's when things started to feel off. First, we started to realize that the previous owner still had a lot of possessions here. It wasn't empty like you'd think it would have been. It was quite literally abandoned. I'm not just talking about furniture, but there were books, an old TV, posters on the walls. It was like someone left one day and never came back. We noticed a really creepy poster on the wall that looked like it was from the 70s or so. It had a picture of two teddy bears making out. We started to feel uncomfortable seeing this, because who would have a poster of that in their living room? There was also old Playboy magazines from the 70s, I think, sitting on the table. In hindsight, I guess that's not really weird, but to 13-year-old me, it seemed odd. Especially since, again, this was in the living room, and you'd think they would have been stashed in a bedroom somewhere. We then decided to go check out the upstairs where the bedrooms were. We were careful not to step on the various amounts of animal crap up the stairs. We went into the bedroom on the left and it was almost empty. Just a bed and nothing else. I thought this was odd because downstairs was completely furnished and nothing was moved at all. With nothing to see here, we went out and into the next bedroom. As soon as we entered the next bedroom, I think all three of us immediately freaked out. We looked at the bed to see bloodstains. Old bloodstains. Nothing else in the room except a bloody mattress. No sheets or anything. We all started talking about what it could be at first. We tried to talk it off as possible sweat stains that came with the old mattress, but we knew we were just trying to feel better about what we were seeing. We quickly ran down the stairs and out of the door, back to the safety of our cabin. Just 4 cabins down the road. We still didn't really believe what we had seen. I mean, did we just discover a murder scene? We have no idea. It just sticks with me to this day. I still wonder why the bedrooms were empty while everything else was left untouched downstairs. I believe we may truly have found the room where someone was murdered, so they emptied out everything that may have had blood splatter or evidence. But if that's the case, why leave the mattress? Maybe they had to leave in a hurry and never could come back for it. If you guys have any ideas, please let me know. I haven't tried to go back to that cabin, but maybe one day I will. In 2012, I went to band camp with my daughter who was going into her sophomore year at high school. I was super excited and proud that she joined the marching band. She played the flute. The campground we went to was mainly a Boy Scout campground, but was also used by Girl Scouts and high school bands. The kids were separated into girls in one cabin and boys in another across the practice field, with the appropriate chaperones, moms and dads, volunteers, etc. Band camp days consisted of waking up early, going to the mess hall, and eating, then straight to the field for all-day practice. The only breaks were for meals, bathroom, or to get hydrated as it was also very hot during the day. After the kids would get started with practicing the show routine, we moms would watch for a while, then either go take walks or go back to the cabin to take our showers. The girls' cabin consisted of boys and a girls' bathroom. The next morning we were there is when the weirdness started. The girls refused to utilize both bathrooms to shower and get ready with, and they all would pile into the girls' bathroom. I was like, what the heck? I'm gonna go where no one else is and had my own bathroom, so to speak. I walked into the bathroom to use the toilet after waking up. As I was sitting in the stall, I heard what you would think is the kind of noise you'd hear from steam pipes. I looked up and saw that there were pipes, so I didn't think much more about it. I went about brushing my hair and teeth and getting ready for the day. Every time I would go into this bathroom, I would hear this noise. It was kind of like a hissing or a whispering sound. About the 3rd time of going to use the bathroom and hearing this, I would sit there and try to tune into it. Because honestly, it started to sound like whispering, and I would be the only one in the cabin. Everyone else was on the field. I also started to get this weird feeling that I was not alone. That feeling of being watched. The second morning, I'm using the bathroom. The noise is louder and actually sounds like a voice this time. I just continue what I'm doing. Brush my teeth, brush my hair. As I'm putting my hair up into a ponytail, I hear this voice clear and plain as day, right next to my ear. Hey, can you hear me? I instantly froze, arms in midair, looked to my right to see who's standing there, and there's nobody. I scooped up all of my stuff off the counter and booked it out of the bathroom so fast. I threw my stuff on the bunk and couldn't get out of that cabin fast enough. I ran all the way back to the field. I didn't step another foot into the boys' bathroom for the rest of the week. I gave the doorway a very wide berth every time I walked by it. I used the girls' bathroom for the rest of the time. I told my daughter what happened, and that was it. I didn't know who or what it was, didn't want to know, and I certainly didn't want any attachment upon leaving. I have always been able to feel spirits, a clairsentient, if you will. I have been touched, seen things in my peripheral vision, but never spoken to. That really freaked me out, so I have blocked myself off a little from the spirit world, kind of like a protective barrier. I have other stories that have happened over the years since childhood that I may share in the future. I just wanted to get this one out. I've been listening to your show every night before bed for quite a while now. I like your sense of humor and your shows seem legit. I have a mind-blowing encounter, but no visual encounter. I'll paint the picture for you guys as best as possible in my words. It was Memorial Weekend at my parents' cabin in Frederick, Michigan, Crawford County, Kalkaska. We were on Little Manistee River, off Cameron Bridge and Manistee River Road. Well, the weather was 50 to 60 degrees, and the time was after midnight. It was me, my brother Mike, my brother Cody, and my uncles Darren and Dominic sitting around the fire. It was a clear sky and zero wind, and a quiet night, until all hell broke loose. We were just sitting there conversing at the fire. All of a sudden, we hear this. I just got the chills as I'm telling you this. All of a sudden, this noise changed my life forever, and my aspect of Bigfoot. It went exactly like this, and I will never forget it. Each syllable got louder and louder. Only 30 yards or so from the fire at the top of the hill. It was so dark you couldn't see 15 or 20 feet away from the glow of the bonfire. Anyways, this thing whooped and took off down the hill towards the river. We could hear it crashing and smashing and breaking trees and brush till it got to the river. We heard it splash across the river. It sounded like a rhino charging and taking out everything in its sight. I just got the chills again. So at this point, when that thing whooped in the first crash of breaking of trees, my Uncle Darren jumped out of his chair so fast and bolted to the door and got one of his guns off the rack. We all looked at each other. We were honestly in awe. We all jumped up and ran as fast as we could to the door as well. We were so freaked out, but none of us had any clue why. Now I've been hunting and in the woods ever since I was a little boy. I'm 37 years old now. I have the chills again typing this. I've never, and I mean never, heard an animal make that noise and be that destructively loud ever in my life. It was ape-like almost. No animal I've ever hunted made this whooping noise, not even a bear. I'm telling you, I've hunted everything from bear to moose. Nothing makes this noise. This was like an ape-like sound and it was huge. At least it sounded huge. I never checked the morning after for a sign. I didn't know any better. Now I know, and I'm more familiar with what to look for. But at the time, I was just so scared. When I went home after this trip, I surfed the internet and looked up probably 200 to 300 videos on Bigfoot. I came across one. It's the only one that I could compare to this noise and what we heard. It was a Les Stroud story on Bigfoot encounters, and he goes on about how these wolves would howl and the moose would make these noise when these Bigfoot would come through the area. They would always make this whoop 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 noise. I was like, oh my god, that's what I heard. If I had to take a guess what we all experienced that day, it must have been a Sasquatch of some sort. But maybe it was something different. And if you guys have any ideas of what it could be, please let me know in the comments. And thanks for sharing my story. I live in a large city at the foot of Pikes Peak in Colorado. This story takes place a few years ago in a smaller town in the mountains right near Pikes Peak. A little background about this before we go forward. Here in Colorado, we have history of multiple Native American tribes that once occupied a lot of the land here, but sadly that just isn't the case anymore. Growing up here, we've all heard the legends and just talked about scary stories, but never thought any of them were real, until this happened. My best friend has a log cabin type house far up in the mountains that her dad built from the ground up. We often have sleepovers over there. I'll describe the layout of the house real quick because it will become important later on. She had a trampoline in her living room. Yes, she had a full-size trampoline net, and it's weird, I know. The second floor of her house was open in the way that there was a balcony that you could look over to see the living room. Her brother's room was right up there next to that balcony. It was cut off by like a cubicle type wall for privacy. So it was a normal sleepover where we watch movies and drink hot cocoa on a cold winter night. It was sometime after 1 a.m. when we started to get the trampoline ready for us to sleep on. We were laying down blankets and getting pillows when one of those large cardboard rolls that are left after you use wrapping paper flew over the separating wall of the balcony. Thinking it was her brother, telling us to shut up, we brushed it off. We then go and brush our teeth and wash our faces, and come to see a water bottle on the trampoline that we assumed her brother had thrown over again. My friend grabs it and notices an odd smell coming from it, so she unscrews the lid, and out came a disgusting scent of vomit. Not just any vomit though, like the most potent, disgusting smelling vomit. It made our eyes burn. As we're gagging, we head up the stairs to confront her brother when we see he's not even home. We think he's hiding from us, so we start looking around for him, telling him to come out but get no response. We decided to tell her mom. When we entered her room, we see that her brother is sleeping on the floor next to her parents' bed, and we got really confused. When we woke her mom up at 1 a.m., she obviously was mad, so we had to explain what happened, that her brother was throwing stuff at us from the balcony. She explains that he has been in here since 9 a.m., and we both get chills and our eyes go wide because we realized, if he was here, who was up there? Refusing to go back out there, we sleep in the same room with her mom and stepdad, and in the morning, we get the courage to go upstairs where things were thrown from our horror. It looks like Freddy Krueger went crazy. There were claw marks all over the walls, and through several posters. Books were knocked off shelves and clothes were ripped out of drawers. It was just a complete mess. It looked like a wild animal ruined everything and robbed them at the same time. The scariest thing is, we never heard any of it all night long. Later that day, my friend went to take a shower while I finished my dinner, and about 10 minutes later I hear a blood-curdling scream and run upstairs to find my friend is in tears, naked and afraid. She tries her best to explain what happened to me. What she told me scared me, even to this day. She said while she was mid-shampoo in the shower, eyes closed, she heard the door open and assumed it was me, and just asked if I was finished eating. She got no response, so when she rinsed and looked up, she saw the bathroom empty and thought she was just hearing things, so she brushed it off. So when she got out of the shower, she bent down to put her hair in the towel. When she comes back up, she is face to face with a Native American looking woman with wolf skin on her. She puts her fingers to her lips and says, "Shh." We end up staging the house and tried to investigate who owned the land before her family, and her mother stated that it was only recently that they started selling the land to build upon, due to Native Americans holding it. To this day, we still have so many unanswered questions. Why did that water bottle smell like that? Why were things being thrown at us in the first place? And what were this spirit's true intentions? I have family that lives close to the Ontario-Quebec border in Canada, and specifically near Renfrew County. In this county, there's an old cabin that was built in the early 1940s, and is apparently the place where a certain very famous syphilitic gangster chose to lay low after some prison time. Due to this affiliation, the cabin is locally famous, and people who know where it is get a hoot out of going to check it out. My grandma, step-grandpa, and their best friends, another married couple, went to check it out sometime. It's pretty deep in the surrounding woods, apparently, and when they got there, they were a bit disappointed. An average, run-of-the-mill wood cabin, not in the best repair, with a couple of windows in the front. There was no lock on the door or anything, so the four of them ventured inside, but it was completely empty in there. Nothing but thick dust and some mildew. They figured it was a bust, but they'd made a day of finding the place, so they decided to take some Polaroid pictures as a keepsake. My grandma and her girlfriend, who we will call Deb, went and stood in front of the cabin, and my step-grandpa took some pictures, 6 in total. When they got the photos developed and looked at them, though, they were shocked. In all but one of the 6 photos, my grandma and Deb were completely invisible. The camera was pointed right at them, but they just weren't there. In the 6th shot, they are there, standing and smiling arm in arm. But behind them in the cabin windows, hands and faces and about 10 pairs of hands were pressed up against the glass. 4 discernible human faces right there in the windows, staring at the camera. The cabin was absolutely empty, and there were no other people around for miles. That cabin had no reputation of being haunted either, and yet, these photos, I saw them for myself years ago, were clear as day. My grandma has no other explanation other than ghosts, and I would love to know what you guys think. I can send in a picture for another video if you'd be interested. This is actually a personal story of my own, and when I say that, I do mean yes, this is a personal swamp dweller story. I grew up in rural areas my entire life. Whether it was beef farms in Tennessee or living in the middle of nowhere, Florida, I've done it all. Growing up without access to most commonalities we have grown accustomed to. Yeah, that's right. We had no internet, no TV, and yep, you guessed it, no cell phones. I know, the horror, right? I like to think of us as the last true generation before the internet age. Not to say dial-up wasn't around, but most of us at the time really didn't have access to it. But honestly, it really wasn't all that bad outside of the long, boring summer days where we would be cooking alive in the fields. Living out in an old Civil War cabin in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, definitely shelled out some interesting experiences. This story is going to be one of the many I may share in the future if you guys want to hear more of my personal stories in these videos. That is if you enjoy it though. This story starts off like any other really. It was a typical Friday night, and my brothers and I were home alone. Being as we didn't have much of anything to entertain ourselves with, we began playing manhunt in and around the house. Most of the time we opted to stay indoors as it was pitch black outside. For a bit more context, our cabin was situated on the top of a rather steep hill that had a long winding driveway running down it. Our cabin had a basement level, the main level where most of the house was, and the upstairs that only had my room. We also had a back deck that was situated about 10 to 12 feet in the air, if I had to guess. Anyway, back to the story at hand. It was pitch black outside, and going much further than our front porch at night really wasn't much of anything anyone enjoyed doing out there. The game was fun, but was already getting pretty monotonous with the little room we had inside. At this point I had the bright idea to wander off outside and hide on the roof to make the game a little bit more interesting. This would soon be one of my biggest regrets in life. At first, everything honestly seemed fine. It was rather cold as it was nearing fall, and the weather was just starting to change. There was a slight breeze and the air was crisp and calming. After a few minutes of sitting up on the roof though, something felt off. I had been practically mesmerized by the sound of the crickets and cicadas. I realized though that all the noise had suddenly stopped. This to me seemed very odd, but at the same time, being as naive as I was, I didn't realize that only meant something bad was going to happen. I sit there, as still as possible for a moment, trying to listen as closely as I can. I just can't seem to hear anything aside from the slight breeze through the leaves. Then, as quickly as the silence came, an eruption of noise came from the other end of the roof. For a bit more detail, we had a metal roof at the time, making it very easy to hear when things would walk on the roof. It sounded like something had landed on the opposite end of the roof. I looked over, but could see nothing. This of course left me rather unnerved, and my first thought was to exit the situation. Before panicking fully, I remembered it could be my brothers messing with me, since surely they would have given up looking for me by now. I opened up my window and called my brothers. They both ran up the stairs shouting and complaining that the roof was off limits. As my oldest brother got to me, I asked him if he had been messing with me and making noises on the roof. He, of course, denied this and wanted to come up and investigate. So he and I slowly made our way to the middle of the roof and listened for a moment. Everything went quiet around us as it had earlier. At this point, I was already on edge and ready to karate chop a demon in the neck if I had to. We hear what sounds like a pounding noise on the far end of the roof in the opposite direction of where we were standing. After what I think were 3 sets of 6 pounding noises, it charged us. Well, I think it did anyway. It sounded like hooves were running on the metal roof, but the only issue is we couldn't see a thing. The entire roof was clear aside from us, that is, but somehow we were hearing these footsteps. We could even feel the indentations going around us. It quickly approached us and began running circles around us. I held my arms out to try to see if I could feel anything, but I couldn't. The weirdest part of it all, though, is that I could feel the vibrations of the footsteps. But I could not actually see anything in the air, or feel anything. The footsteps circled us for what seemed like many minutes, but were probably no more than a minute or so at most. It suddenly stopped circling us, and we could hear the steps trail off the roof and disappear into thin air. We quickly ran inside and locked the windows and doors and huddled up inside, freaked the hell out. This is just one of the many creepy stories I have had in this cabin. As I said in the start of the story, if you guys would like me to share more stories, I will gladly do so. I know I don't very much share my stories on this channel because I'd like to share your stories. But if you'd like to hear more, let me know in the comments. And thank you guys for listening to my story. Thanks for listening to these creepy and allegedly true outdoors horror stories sent in by viewers just like you. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, whether it's an outdoors story or something else, be sure to submit that at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this show going. If you enjoyed these stories, please be sure to hit that like button. The more likes this video gets, the more the algorithm promotes it on YouTube. If you're new to the channel, why not join us? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a new video. I upload them almost every single day on all things natural and supernatural. If you're on the go and you don't have YouTube Premium, you can download your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories and bring them with you wherever you go on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and just about anywhere else you find your favorite podcast. And the best part is it's 100% free, and it helps the swamp out so much more. Thank you guys so much for supporting the swamp the way you do. I couldn't do this without you. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.